In this video, we're going to talk about virtue ethics. So virtue ethics is a theory that an act is morally right just because it is one that a virtuous person acting in character would do in that situation. So unlike previous theories that appeal to things like principles of action or uh, or assessments of outcomes, this is a theory that focuses on the character of the individual person who's doing the action. So to try to apply a principle like this, so what would be a virtue ethical answer to a trolley problem? It would be pull the lever or not, depending upon what a virtuous person would do in the same situation. So already, like with other theories, we see that there's an open question here. We're appealing to something. We're appealing to what a virtuous person would do. But there's still a further answer as to what a virtuous person is. So if we think a virtuous person is somebody who acts sort of like a utilitarian, then the answer would be, uh, save the most people, harm the least. That would be to pull the lever and save the five. That would also be what we might call a beneficent person if we're talking in terms of prima facie duties. Somebody who has a duty to help, maybe a virtuous person has a duty to help. And in that case, the answer would be also to pull the lever and save the five. But we also might wonder, well, why is that what a virtuous person would do? Maybe a virtuous person is a totally non-maleficent person, which is to say they never harm anyone. So a totally non-maleficent person would not pull the lever because they wouldn't want to harm the one. That's without going into questions about action versus inaction. But you see the distinction we're trying to make there. The non-maleficent person would be the one who does not take action that would be that would directly cause someone to be harmed. So we have this open question: what a virtuous person is, but we do have an answer to the trolley problem in a sense. Still, the answer is whatever a virtuous person would do. We just have to figure out what a virtuous person would do. And the basic answer to that, at least Aristotle's answer, who was maybe the first documented virtue theorist, and some of the virtue theorists that have followed him, it has to do with following virtues. So there are these specific there's these specific qualities that people have, these virtues, and people follow the virtues. And if you don't follow the virtues, then you are a vicious person. You've committed vices. If you follow the virtues, then you are a virtuous person. Aristotle, at least, defines these virtues in terms of medians between extremes. So an example we might give is courage. So Aristotle thinks that courage is a virtue. And how do we distinguish courage as a virtue? Well, Aristotle thinks that it can be identified as a virtue because it's in the middle of one extreme, which is cowardice, and another extreme, which is rashness. You don't want to be too rash. That's a vice, and you don't want to be too cowardly. That's a vice. You want to be courageous, which is the proper amount of courage for a given situation, which is often referred to just colloquially as something like having a happy medium. It's like a Goldilocks principle. You don't want the bed too hard. You don't want the bed too soft. You want it just right. And that's sort of what the that's what Aristotle's answer to how to be a virtuous person might be. But that's something that people can disagree about, right? Because Aristotle's giving a very vague answer. He's just saying that it's a medium between extremes. But people's mediums might be very different. So there's still some questions there about how to answer, how to apply the the doctrine, or how to apply the maxim of doing what a virtuous person would do. So what are some advantages to virtue ethics? So one, it rejects the idea that there's a simple formula for determining how to act. Right? It's not a simple principle. You have to develop virtue, and developing virtue is a complicated process that requires training and education. So it's not just simple. No easy answer. Another advantage is that it seems like moral wisdom is the kind of know-how that requires training and experience. It's not just something like having a good IQ and a reading list. So being virtuous is something you have to practice and something that you have to get in the habit of. It's not just a rule that you follow. It's sort of a way of life that you have cultivated in yourself. There's also some disadvantages to virtue ethics. So one disadvantage is it seems very vague. So we would like to have something more than this advice: do what a virtuous person would do. As we saw with the trolley problem, it's not totally clear what a virtuous person would do, because it's not clear what a virtuous person is without defining the virtues. And so we'd like to have some more practical, like some rules of thumb there. We'd like to have something more to go on. And the virtuous would say, well, it's complicated. And we'd be like, yeah, well, can you start can you start describing some of those complications for us? Another disadvantage is, how do we decide who the role models should be? So we're talking about this virtuous person. Who is the virtuous person? Is it Aristotle? Is it Socrates? Is it Jesus? Is it any of the other philosophers that we've looked at? It's not clear who the virtuous person is, and it's probably different for different people who they would say the virtuous person is. And then that leads to a further disadvantage, which is, if there are many virtuous people, then what if they disagree? So we have lots of people we think are virtuous, let's say. Which one do we follow? Let's say they disagree about the answer to the trolley problem. So do we pull the lever or not? How do we decide? Do we have them vote? What's the criteria for deciding between different virtuous people? And the other disadvantage is we need to explain virtue in terms of duty and not the other way around. So this seems like a serious concern. When we ask what makes a person have virtue, what usually we start trying to think of is, what are the things that they do? What are the duties that they ascribe themselves to? What are the rules that they follow? And it's those rules and those duties and those principles that make them virtuous. But virtue ethics answers that question the opposite way. So the Kantian says virtue is described in terms of duty, but the person who's following Aristotle, the virtue ethicist, says duty is determined in terms of virtue. And that seems much more confusing. So you have a duty that doesn't, you don't have a virtue that follows from your duty. You have a duty that follows from your virtue. So then how does a duty follow from someone's virtue? How can we think of duties as the things that would follow from those qualities that a virtuous person has? And when we think of it like that, it's less like a duty and more like Just we're describing the habits of virtuous people. So there are these virtuous people, they do certain things, those are the habits that they do. And that's what we mean when we say duty. But that doesn't really seem like the way that we use the word duty. So it seems like we're not talking about the same kind of thing. It's also not clear. It's also not clear how there could be virtue without duty. So, let's say somebody has courage, and that's a virtue. Well, why is that a virtue? The virtue ethicist has to say that that courage is that's the good in itself, is that courage. But it seems more plausible to say, well, the good thing about courage is that you have the courage to fulfill your duties in times when your duties need to be fulfilled. That's what courage is for. So the virtue ethicist has to give an explanation of that. That would seem reasonable in order to avoid that kind of a problem.